we are now turning over to Reverend Brandan Robertson, who is an LGBTQIA plus friendly pastor, to explore his views on conversion therapy. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for making space and time to have me this evening and to have this really important conversation. As you've heard, my name is Reverend Brandan Robertson. I use he, him pronouns. I'm originally from Maryland and currently live in Washington, D.C. It was actually while I was a student in Chicago in 2013 that I was first forced to go through conversion therapy, which I'll talk about in just a few moments. But at an event like this sort of forum could have been so tremendously helpful to me back then, and I'm so grateful that it's being offered today. I want to begin by telling you who I am today. I'm an openly gay Christian pastor, author, and theologian. Over the past 8 years, I've had the honor of traveling all around the world and speaking to thousands of LGBT people of faith. And I've been blown away every place that I've gone because I've met people who have told me they're going through conversion therapy or have gone through conversion therapy. On the surface, most people in the public and most people in Christian churches don't even realize how prevalent conversion therapy is in the US and around the world. And one reason is because conversion therapy is rarely, if ever, called conversion therapy. Obviously, due to the tremendous work of folks like the ones we are going to hear on this panel that we've already heard from, there's been a huge spotlight in recent years on conversion therapy. And most organizations and churches have gone great lengths to rebrand themselves. And even one of the leading conversion therapy organizations, founded by a deeply troubling man named Dr. Joseph Nicolosi, who is the pioneer of modern conversion therapy, they've recently rebranded and now call themselves reintegrative therapy, which sounds pretty legit, doesn't it? The problem that also exists is that while there are tons of programs like the ones Garrett went to, and a ton of so-called therapists practicing these dangerous and universally condemned attempts to change one's sexuality as part of their psychological practice, there are 3 times as many programs that take place in churches and religious camps that don't claim to be psychologically based, but use all the same ideas and practices cloaked in religious language and seek to change LGBT people's sexuality or gender identity. This was my experience. I wasn't sent off to a camp, nor did I spend time in a registered psychotherapist's office trying to change my sexuality. No, my experience in conversion therapy happened primarily in a professor's office at the Moody Bible Institute and at a prominent church in Wheaton, Illinois. You see, when I arrived at Moody Bible Institute as a freshman in 2010, I couldn't have been more excited. Since the age of 12, I felt called to be a pastor, and I knew as a committed as a fundamentalist, that going to Moody was the next right step to becoming this man that I wanted to be and living into this calling that I had. I wasn't a super popular kid in high school because everyone knew me as Bible boy, and I would walk around my school trying to proselytize people and evangelize people. And it was in middle school that I realized for the first time that I had what can be called same-sex attractions. But as soon as those feelings emerged, they were met with strong resistance in my head, because I knew what my church said that the Bible said, that being gay was an abomination, and that therefore I needed to bury the struggle as deeply as I could. So I did. I started dating a cheerleader in high school, and I believed that if I could just make it through and get to the Moody Bible Institute, I'd be free from my temptation. After all, many Bible colleges, Moody included, have a motto, ring by spring, and it's the expectation that every young man who enters that school to study pastoral ministry, you'll also not only get a degree, but a wife. So when I arrived at Moody, I breathed a sigh of relief. I'd made it. I was in effectively what could be called a monastery full of young evangelicals studying for ministry. and I believed I would certainly have a wife within a few semesters, so I was sitting pretty. On the first week of my first semester, however, as I was moving into my dorm, a young man a few doors down knocked on my door to introduce himself to me. When I opened the door, this young student introduced himself, and like a good Bible college student, after chatting for a bit, we scheduled a time to go have coffee and get to know one another. It was at this coffee meeting that we did what every student at Moody does: give a little bit of our background, talk about how we came to faith, and then start talking about the sin that we struggle with, and commit to being accountability partners for one another. Totally normal stuff, right? Well, I remember that as we were sitting in Starbucks, this young man looked at me and said, "I want to be really honest. I haven't shared this with anyone else, but I struggle with same-sex attraction." And as he spoke those words, my heart dropped to my stomach, because I thought I had escaped this. I thought it was only me who had dealt with this. And before I could even process what I had just heard, the words "me too" came out of my mouth, and thus opened Pandora's box as we journey together for the next 4 years, studying the Bible and seeking to overcome our sexual attractions. So much happened over the course of my 4 years at Moody, but for the sake of time, let's skip to the final year and a half. During my time at Moody, I began being mentored by a professor who's quite well known in the evangelical world for his ex-gay testimony. I had confessed to this professor my struggle, and he was walking with me to ensure that I stayed on the straight and narrow path. But as I learned, as I studied the Bible, as I grew in my understanding, I began to have more and more questions about what the Bible actually taught. And when I arrived on campus my senior year, I was greeted by a letter from the Dean of Students requesting that I immediately come to his office to meet with a professor. It was in that meeting that the dean told me that this trusted professor who I'd been confessing my struggles with had told the dean that he was worried about where my trajectory was heading and thought that I was going to graduate and start waving rainbow flags. So he suggested that I meet with another professor who was known for befriending gay students. I went into that professor's office, and in no uncertain terms, she sat me down and told me that she thought I was deceived and a liar, that I was being influenced by the devil because of the questions I was asking. And she gave me a book that you can also see on your screen right now called Shame and Attachment Loss by Dr. Joseph Nicolosi. This book was the clinical text that formed the basis for the theory of conversion therapy. And its message can be summed up pretty succinctly. Gay men are created by having an over-attached mother and a distant or abusive father. Since that was actually my upbringing, the professor demanded that I read the book and told me that I needed to start meeting with yet another colleague, one who was an ex-lesbian, and she could help me overcome my same-sex attraction. She said that if I intended to graduate, I needed to prove my faithfulness to Moody's beliefs by doing this. And at the time, I was still a faithful evangelical. And I was also a very scared student who was deeply concerned that everyone on campus seemed to think I was demonic. So I began meeting with this other professor. Every week for the next year, as I met with this professor, she performed a practice called healing prayer on me. And while this didn't claim to be a psychological approach to therapy, it was based on Dr. Nicolosi's model. Every week, I was asked to confess my sins of lust for the same sex to her. And then we'd go into a deep state of prayer where we would ask God to reveal the places of abuse in my past, and then invite Jesus entering into that scene to comfort and protect me. At the end, I'd be anointed with holy water, which, by the way, is not something evangelicals typically believe in. And the healing of Jesus over my trauma would be sealed. The idea was that by healing these abusive memories, I would undo my wounding and no longer be gay. I did this every week for my senior year. The problem was, I knew it wasn't working. In fact, over spring break, me and that same student that I met on the first week at Moody, we had committed our biggest sin yet. We ended up kissing once. And because of our conditioning, we were overcome with shame. I literally ran back to that professor and confessed this sin. And she sent us out to a church in Wheaton, Illinois, to have an intensive prayer session. And it was a church where the other woman you see on the screen, Leanne Payne, started this special version of prayer to heal gay folks. So as we arrived in Wheaton, we were sat down together in front of this panel of pastors and asked to confess our lusts about one another in front of each other. We were told that our friendship needed to be immediately over for the sake of our souls. We were taken into separate rooms, we were anointed with holy water, and the pastors prayed in tongues over us, seeking to cast out the homosexual desires within us. As all of this was happening, I was confused, frustrated, embarrassed, ashamed, angry. I was experiencing this utterly humiliating practice, and I knew it wasn't working. But we returned to Moody, and we didn't talk to each other anymore because we believed that this is what God wanted. I was devastated because my best friend was cut off from me, and my therapy wasn't working, and my professors continued to shame me for my lack of progress. What saved me from an utter breakdown at this time was the fact that I had some semblance of sense to begin attending an affirming Christian church just a few blocks from Moody. And that community embraced me in the midst of my struggle and assured me that no matter what happened, I would be supported and loved by them. Clearly, there's so much more to this story. Once I left Moody, I eventually did come out and began advocating and writing and preaching about the need for theological and social change on behalf of LGBT folks. But what I want to highlight is that in my experience, the story you've heard that has all of these interesting components that sometimes can seem quite surreal, these are not surreal at all. These are super common. Since graduating Moody, I've met at least 50 other students who have gone through Moody Bible Institute alone and have the same sort of experiences. None of us went to clinical conversion therapy programs. All of us went to church-based so-called spiritual programs to change our sexuality. And because these are considered religious practices, churches and schools across the country are allowed to practice these things without ever being called to account. The other problem is that with all of these practices, there is a lack of consent. While it's true, I was over the age of 18 when I was pushed into healing prayer, my religious beliefs and community made it almost impossible for me to say no. Getting expelled from college was the least of my worries. I was threatened with eternal hell. When you really believe these things, there's very little ability to say no when healing prayer or conversion therapy are offered. The psychological manipulation of that theology is tremendously powerful. And when these therapies and practices don't work, there's only one theological conclusion given. Either you're not trying hard enough, you're insincere, or you're being influenced by the devil. Again, if you really believe this kind of distress and anxiety, it's unimaginable. And if you have no one speaking to you an alternative message, like I did because of the church I ended up going to, there's really only two options: to suppress and pretend that your sexuality doesn't exist, or to move towards self-destruction. While there may never be a legal way in our country to ban spiritual conversion therapy because it's considered a religious practice, it's essential that we continue to make the public aware of these practices and let you know that they're not just happening in these odd churches on the edges, but in mainstream megachurches as well. We need to keep lifting up the truth that there is another way to be LGBT and Christian, one that embraces your sexuality as a God-created gift. We must raise up the stories of LGBT people of faith so that those who are struggling amid abusive spiritual treatments like healing prayer know that there is an alternative. And of course, we need to continue to fight the legal battle to ban conversion therapy being practiced by licensed psychologists, because every major psychological association in the country has not only concluded that it doesn't work, but that it causes tremendous, measurable psychological and spiritual harm. Events like this are so important for this very reason, because they raise up stories and truth about the practice of conversion therapy. And I'm so very grateful for the opportunity to be here today and to get to share a little bit of my story. So thank you.
Wanted to thank you, Reverend Brandan, for being willing to share your story with us today. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions before we progressed with the presentation. I know that there's a history of scripture being weaponized against the LGBTQI plus community. And I know that it's a mistranslation and it's a history of mistranslations in the Bible. And I was hoping you might be able to speak a little bit on that.
Yeah, totally. I've studied this topic, this is what my whole master's degree was on, and outside of this, I've just done a lot of research into the biblical texts. And the truth is there are 6 verses in the Bible that people generally say condemn homosexuality. Each and every one of them, if you understand them in their cultural context, are clearly not referring to what we are talking about when we're talking about LGBT identity. Instead, almost every one of them are talking about an ancient practice of temple prostitution. And what's being condemned is this monotheistic religion that is condemning this polytheistic faith, where men and women would sacrifice themselves sexually to appease gods and goddesses. That is the context of the scripture, and clearly that's not what's happening here. And in fact, there is only one spot in scripture that sexual minorities are legitimately mentioned, and it's when Jesus talks about eunuchs, who were first century versions of sexual and gender minorities, and he speaks of them affirmingly. He says they will enter the kingdom of heaven, and he actually lifts them up as an example for others. And so my conclusion of the scripture is that you're right. There's been not only misinterpretation, but frankly, just misunderstanding, people who haven't done their work, and they've weaponized these 6 verses to condemn and harm LGBT people.
Thank you. The last question I wanted to ask you prior to moving on to the next part of our presentation was, let me see here. Here we are. What would you say to people who are realizing that they have families that realize that they have a LGBTQI plus child, and they realize that they're trying to wrestle with the fact that with what they believe their faith is telling them, and the fact that they're realizing that their child is a part of this community?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I always say is that when theology and reality come into contact, when they clash, it's your theology that should change. As Christians, we believe that humans are finite beings trying to talk about the infinite God. And needs to be a level of humility that we're all going to be wrong about a lot of things. And the one thing that scripture is clear on is that we are called to love one another, love our neighbors, love those who are different than us. And so as you're looking at your child, just remember that God's own heart in the Bible is one of love and grace. And even if you can't understand their sexuality or gender identity, even if you don't know how to square it with your faith, your first response should be to love, embrace, and accept. And then you can do the theological work later. There's plenty of resources out there to help you, both just through books and through groups like the Q Christian Network that can help you dig deeper into what the Bible and the Christian tradition actually says about sexuality. But always, always, first, love is the response, and everything else should come after that.